Mother Bear brought a bleeding man home. No one could believe what happened next. The forest was still when Thomas Blake stepped into it, as if holding its breath. Beneath the deepening dusk, towering pines stood like ancient guardians around Pine Lake, their limbs heavy with the weight of early frost. The wind had quieted to a whisper, and the crunch of Thomas's boots on the brittle underbrush seemed louder than usual. He paused briefly, adjusting his pack and taking in the golden light that filtered through the branches, fractured and flickering as the sun slipped behind the ridge line. The day had begun with the promise of routine, a check on tree conditions before winter's full arrival. It was the kind of work Thomas had done for nearly 2 decades as a forestry technician, and though the years had weathered his body, he still felt most alive when wrapped in wilderness. He scribbled a few quick notes on bark thickness and needle drop, glanced up at the fading light, and figured he had maybe 30 minutes before he needed to head back. The trail he followed was barely a suggestion at this point, overgrown and seldom used, but Thomas preferred these lesser-walked paths. They felt more honest. He navigated around a fallen log, brushing off ice crystals that clung to his gloves, and pressed on toward the western ridge, where he'd seen a cluster of pines browning prematurely. Something about them nagged at him, a disease, maybe, or beetles. Either way, it warranted a closer look. As he climbed, the air grew thinner and colder. His breath came in soft clouds, curling into the growing shadows. He paused to take a sip of water and noticed how quiet the forest had become. Not even bird song lingered, just the faint rustle of a breeze too weak to move the trees. He found the cluster of pines nestled in a hollow near a shallow ravine. The ground here was slick, carpeted with damp needles and scattered rocks. Thomas crouched to inspect the base of one tree when his boot slipped, pitching him forward. He reached out instinctively, but the ground gave way beneath him. His shoulder struck something hard, rock or root, and then came the crack of his head against stone. The world tilted, spun, and then dissolved into darkness. When Thomas didn't return by sunset, Emily Blake felt the first twinge of unease. Her husband was a creature of habit, grounded and dependable in a way few others were. He always texted when he was on his way back, even if the signal in the woods was spotty. She checked her phone again, but no messages. The cabin felt colder in his absence. She tried to shake the worry off, telling herself he was probably finishing up a note, watching the stars for a moment, letting the forest speak to him like it always did. But by 8 p.m., she knew something was wrong. She bundled into her coat and drove to the ranger station, headlights cutting through falling flurries. The rangers took her seriously, their respect for Thomas ran deep. Within the hour, a search and rescue team was mobilized, but visibility was low and the terrain dangerous in the dark. They would begin their grid search at first light. Emily returned home, heart aching, refusing to sleep. She made tea, left the porch light on, and sat wrapped in a blanket, eyes on the tree line. Meanwhile, the forest had grown colder still, a frost crept across branches and coated the earth in white. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices rising like mournful bells in the night. Thomas lay motionless beneath a pine bough, his breath shallow, a thin trickle of blood crusting in his hair. His body began to tremble involuntarily, the forest leaching warmth from his bones. Hours passed. The moon climbed high, casting pale light over the hills and valleys, silvering the tips of snow-laced trees. It was near midnight when the bear appeared. She was massive, her coat dark as midnight and shaggy from the coming cold. She moved with the careful authority of a mother and was followed closely by a cub no larger than a golden retriever. They had been foraging for roots and berries near the lake's edge when the scent caught her nose, not fear or blood, but something quieter. Weakness, suffering, a presence that did not belong in silence. She led her cub cautiously toward the scent, her breath misting before her as she approached the unmoving form beneath the tree. The man reeked of human things, sweat, smoke, pine soap. But beneath all that, there was something ancient, the scent of pain. She circled him once, sniffed, then nudged his boot gently with her snout. No response. Her cub watched from behind a tree, curious but hesitant. She sniffed again, then stepped closer, placing a heavy paw near his chest to feel the movement of breath. It was there, faint, fading. The cold would take him before the dawn. Most bears would have left. Many would have ignored him. A few, driven by fear or hunger, might have harmed him. But not this one. Something in her recognized what was needed. She lowered her massive frame beside him, pressing her warmth against his side. He stirred faintly, moaning something unintelligible. She waited a moment longer, then, with a grunt, shifted her position, using her powerful limbs to roll him gently onto her back. It wasn't graceful, his arm flopped awkwardly, and she paused to adjust her stance before beginning to move. Her cub trotted ahead, stopping every few paces to glance back. Together, they slipped into the dark forest, beneath branches heavy with frost, beneath stars blinking through skeletal trees. They traveled slowly. The man's weight was awkward, but she bore it without hesitation. The path she took was instinctive, winding, not toward her den, but toward something else. Something she had passed before. A place where the forest opened, where strange smells lingered. A place of human things. Above them, snow began to fall, light at first, then steadier. It coated the bear's back, catching on Thomas's jacket. Guardian, as she would one day be named, trudged on, leaving a trail of steaming breath and deep paw prints in the new snow. Occasionally, the man groaned or shifted, and she would pause, huff once, then continue. The cub, though playful by nature, remained quiet as if sensing the weight of the moment. Back at the cabin, Emily sat rigid in the porch chair, eyes swollen from worry. The forest was a void in front of her, unknowable, untouchable, and somewhere in that silence, her husband was lost. She couldn't imagine him alone out there. Couldn't imagine what he might be facing, cold, fear, maybe worse. The hours crawled by. She lit the porch lantern, whispered prayers, told herself she'd hear his footsteps any moment now. And deep within the woods, a bear carried a man home. The night deepened as the bear carried the unconscious man across the cold and silent forest. Snow fell steadily now, sifting through the tall trees like powdered stars, blanketing the earth in a soft, glittering hush. The moonlight filtered through in ribbons, sometimes catching the gentle steam that rose from the bear's broad shoulders, warming the man draped across her back. Her cub walked a few steps ahead, his small paws sinking into the fresh snow, occasionally stopping to glance back at his mother and the strange, slumped figure she bore. He didn't understand what the man was or why his mother treated him differently from anything else they'd encountered in the wild, but he understood something was happening. Something important. And so he remained close, his round ears twitching at every sound. Guardian, as the humans would later call her, moved with purpose. Though she did not know her destination in any conscious way, her instincts guided her through familiar terrain, weaving around thickets, crossing over narrow streams beginning to freeze, and stepping around places where predators might linger. She avoided a den of foxes, with whom she had once fought for territory, and turned away from a slope where she had lost a cub to a late-season rockfall. The man groaned now and then, a low, fragmented sound that made her pause and listen. His breath had grown shallower, his face pale, and the skin on his cheeks tight from the cold. She leaned into him with her warmth, letting her body heat transfer through layers of wool and cotton to his failing core. The cub nestled briefly against her leg for warmth before bounding forward again with a burst of youthful curiosity. She didn't scold him, her mind was focused on one thing, keeping the man alive. Unconscious, Thomas drifted in and out of a strange twilight state, his body locked in a half-sleep, half-fog where time bent and memory distorted. He dreamed of pine trees dripping in gold, of Emily's voice calling from far away, and of being a child again, holding his grandfather's hand while walking a trail. His grandfather used to tell him tales of the woods, strange, impossible things that danced the line between fact and folklore. One in particular surfaced now, unbidden, a story of a man lost during a snowstorm, rescued not by other men but by a great bear that carried him to safety. As a child, Thomas had loved the idea, as a teenager, he had laughed it off, as an adult, he had forgotten it entirely. But now, floating on the edge between life and death, that tale came back like a whispered promise. He felt warmth beneath him, a steady, living rhythm like the thrum of a beating heart. He smelled fur, clean and earthy like sun-warmed bark. Somewhere deep within himself, he knew he was not alone. He did not feel afraid. The snow thickened by the hour, lying in a heavy crust over the trees, softening every sound. The bear trudged through it with patience, her breath rasping in the cold, her movements deliberate. She was beginning to tire, her muscles aching from the man's weight, and the cub was slowing down, his paws not yet strong enough for the deepening snow. Still, she pressed forward, drawn toward a place she had passed in warmer months, where strange structures stood on the edge of the forest. The scent there was like the man's, a mixture of human and earth. She had once seen smoke rise from a chimney and heard music echo faintly through the woods. The place had never felt dangerous. She had avoided it then, but tonight it called to her. Miles away, the search team had begun to assemble. Snowplows had cleared the first few roads, and flashlights cut across the dark as rangers marked the last place Thomas's GPS had pinged. They moved cautiously, calling his name into the woods, hoping for an answer but preparing for the worst. Meanwhile, Emily had not slept. She remained wrapped in a quilt on the porch, the lantern glowing beside her, eyes red from weeping. She sipped lukewarm tea, her ears straining for any sound beyond the soft hush of snow. In her chest, hope flickered like the tiniest flame. She did not know what she was waiting for, only that it hadn't arrived yet. By the time Guardian reached the forest edge, dawn had begun to rise. The sky shifted from black to pale gray, then to the soft pink of a winter sunrise. The snow glowed faintly under the growing light, and the first birds dared a song from high in the trees. Guardian emerged into the clearing just beyond the cabin's yard. The light from the porch lantern still burned. She paused beneath the trees, watching the strange wooden dwelling. It was silent but alive. She sniffed the air, caught the scent of the same human now slumped on her back. Her cub stepped beside her, blinking at the sudden openness of the space. Emily saw them first as movement, a large shadow at the tree lean. She stood quickly, heart leaping into her throat. It was a bear, a massive black bear, larger than any she'd seen. And beside it, no, not beside it, on it, something lay draped across the bear's back. Something limp. Someone. Thomas. Her body moved before her mind caught up. She dropped the tea and stumbled down the steps into the yard, snow soaking her slippers. She didn't scream, didn't run. Something about the scene was too surreal, too fragile. She stopped several feet away, blinking in disbelief. The bear did not growl, did not rear or run. Instead, she stepped forward slowly, lowered herself, and with astonishing gentleness, rolled Thomas from her back and onto the snow. Emily gasped and knelt beside him. His skin was cold, but his chest moved, barely. She sobbed his name, touched his face, felt for a pulse. It was there, weak, but alive. Behind her, she heard only one more sound, the soft retreating footsteps of the bear and her cub, disappearing back into the woods like a dream vanishing with the dawn. Emily held Thomas's face, murmuring his name over and over, pressing her warmth against him. "You're okay," she whispered, though she didn't yet believe it. "You're okay. You're home." By the time the paramedics arrived 20 minutes later, Thomas was semi-conscious. His eyes fluttered open, but he could not form words. They wrapped him in thermal blankets, checked his vitals, and loaded him into the ambulance. Emily followed close behind, her mind still spinning with what she'd seen. When they asked where she found him, she could only point toward the forest. "A bear," she said quietly. "A bear brought him home." No one knew what to say to that. But later, as the snow melted under the paramedics' boots, a ranger crouched beside the spot where Thomas had lain and found deep, fresh bear tracks. And beside them, tangled in a pine branch, a single strand of black fur. The hum of the hospital machines was soft and rhythmic, a mechanical lullaby rising and falling with each of Thomas Blake's slow, steady breaths. The room was warm, almost too warm, with the heat turned up high and extra blankets tucked around him. A nurse moved quietly in the corner, adjusting his fore while Emily sat beside the bed, her fingers wrapped around his hand like an anchor in the tide. It had been nearly 12 hours since he'd arrived, half-frozen, concussed, but alive because of a bear. That sentence still felt unreal in her mind, like something borrowed from a fairy tale or an old folk tale whispered at campfires. And yet it had happened. She had seen it with her own eyes, had watched as the massive black bear had emerged from the forest at dawn, with her husband draped across her back like a child carried home. She had knelt beside him, feeling the warmth from the bear's body still clinging to his jacket, and looked up to meet the animal's eyes for the briefest moment before it turned and vanished into the trees. There had been no aggression, no confusion, just purpose, just quiet understanding. The doctors were baffled. Thomas had suffered a moderate concussion, some bruised ribs, and mild hypothermia. But given how long he'd been missing in freezing temperatures, his condition was far better than anyone had expected. When the paramedics had first arrived, they had assumed he'd taken shelter somewhere, maybe fallen asleep in a hollowed log or under a thicket. But Emily had told them the truth, or at least what she had seen. She had watched their faces twist with disbelief. "A bear brought him back," she said it plainly, with no theatrics, no exaggeration, just the truth. They had humored her at first, nodded politely, but she saw it in their eyes. They thought she was in shock, inventing a miracle to cope with fear. But the rangers had come. They had seen the tracks, deep and wide and unmistakable, leading from the forest right up to the spot where Thomas had been placed. They had found black bear fur stuck in the bark of a low branch. They had measured the prints and identified the pattern, a female with a cub. There had been sightings in the region of a large black bear traveling with a small cub. Locals had called her the Shadow because she moved like one, quiet, calm, rarely seen, never aggressive. But no one had ever imagined this. Back at the cabin, the snow had begun to melt slightly under the afternoon sun. The search and rescue team had packed up their work, complete. Emily had returned briefly to pick up a few things, walking slowly across the snow-covered yard where the bear had stood just that morning. It felt sacred now, like hallowed ground. She paused and knelt, touching the place where Thomas had lain, and whispered a simple, shaky thank you. Then she stood and walked back inside, the door creaking behind her like a sigh. Thomas stirred that evening, his voice slurred but coherent. Cold, he muttered, and Emily was there in an instant, brushing his hair back, pressing her forehead to his. "I'm here," she whispered. "You're safe. You're home." He blinked slowly, his mind a haze of flickering images and fractured memories, the fall, the pain, the endless dark, and then something warm, something alive, not human. He didn't remember being lifted, didn't remember the journey, but he remembered a dream, soft fur, steady movement, a feeling of being held. "Something carried me," he said finally, eyes locked on hers. "Something big. I was warm. I thought I was dead. But it didn't feel like death." Emily smiled gently, tears in her eyes. "It was a bear, Thomas. A real one. She brought you home." He stared at her, confused, then slowly nodded, as if some part of him had always known. Over the next few days, news spread. At first, it was just whispers. A ranger mentioned it to a colleague, someone posted on a local wildlife forum, and suddenly the tale of the bear who rescued a man began to ripple outward. Local journalists came first, then regional news stations, and within a week, it hit national headlines. "Guardian Bear Rescues Lost Forester," one headline read. "Kindness from the wild," said another. Wildlife experts debated it fiercely. Some were skeptical, calling it an anomaly, an accidental behavior misunderstood. Others were cautious but intrigued, citing rare examples of maternal animals responding to distress, even across species. But the evidence was irrefutable: the tracks, the fur, the physical condition of Thomas when found, and most of all, Emily's clear, unwavering account. It wasn't just a miracle story, it was real. Thomas recovered slowly, taking walks with a cane through the woods behind their cabin, always stopping at the clearing where Guardian had stood. He began to leave small offerings there, fruit, nuts, sometimes a bit of honey. He didn't know if she'd come back, didn't expect her to, but it felt right to give something in return. Emily joined him often, holding his hand in the silence, listening to the birds, watching the shifting light through the trees. They spoke little during those walks, words weren't necessary. Something had changed between them, something subtle and profound. They had always loved each other, but now there was a thread of deep gratitude woven through that love, gratitude for a second chance, for the mystery of it all, for the miracle that had emerged from the forest. One day, about 3 weeks after the rescue, Thomas was sitting on the porch alone when he noticed movement near the tree line. His breath caught. It was distant, half hidden in the shadows but unmistakable, a large dark figure accompanied by a smaller one. He didn't move, didn't call out, just watched. The bear stood for a moment, her head tilted as if observing him, then she turned and melted back into the woods, silent as snowfall. Thomas let out a long breath, a strange peace settling in his chest. She had come back, not close, not for thanks, but simply to be seen. It was enough. That evening, he and Emily lit a small fire in the clearing. They sat beside it, wrapped in blankets, the warmth of the flames licking their faces. "We should give her a name," Emily said quietly. Thomas thought for a long time, then he said, "Guardian." Emily nodded. "Perfect." From then on, the name stuck. Whenever they spoke of her, which was often, they called her that, Guardian, a name born of awe and affection, a name that captured what she had done, what she had been. Years passed. The story was retold at school assemblies, in nature documentaries, in wildlife lectures around the country. But for Thomas and Emily, it remained deeply personal. Each winter, on the anniversary of his rescue, they placed food in the clearing, carefully and respectfully, then sat in silence and watched the trees. Sometimes nothing came. Sometimes they saw distant movement. And once, just once, they saw the bear again, older now, her cub grown, standing at the edge of the forest in the falling snow, watching them. Thomas never forgot the feeling of being carried through the cold, not by a machine or a person, but by something ancient and wild. He never forgot the warmth of fur, the sound of heavy breath, the steady rhythm of paws crunching through snow. And he never forgot that in the darkest, most hopeless moment of his life, it was not man or medicine that saved him. It was kindness, pure, instinctive, wordless kindness, from the heart of the wild. Snow fell in thick, drifting silence as twilight settled over the forest once more. The trees stood motionless under the growing weight of winter, their branches bowed like solemn monks in prayer. Pine Lake had frozen over, its glassy surface dusted in white, reflecting the pale glow of the early evening sky. In the cabin at the edge of the woods, Thomas Blake stood by the window, watching the forest as if it might speak. Beside him, Emily placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm and familiar. "It's almost time," she said softly. Thomas nodded, pulling on his coat without a word. Every year, on the anniversary of his rescue, they made the walk together, down the path through the clearing, past the birch trees, and into the quiet place where their lives had changed forever. They carried no signs, no phones, no expectations, only a small bundle wrapped in linen, fruit, nuts, and honeycomb placed gently in a basket that smelled faintly of cedar. It was not a tribute, not really, it was gratitude, quiet and steady, like the heart of the forest itself. The trail was half buried, the snow crunching beneath their boots as they moved through the hush. No birds sang, no wind stirred, but the silence wasn't empty. It was watchful, sacred. They reached the clearing just as the last light faded from the sky, casting long shadows across the snow. Thomas set the basket down near the edge, beneath the twisted old pine where the tracks had once been. He stood still for a moment, listening to the forest breathe. Emily moved beside him, slipping her fingers through his gloved hand. They didn't speak. Words had never been necessary in this place. It was enough just to stand there, remembering. Guardian had not been seen since that last glimpse years ago, now a silent shadow at the tree lean. But her absence didn't feel like loss. She had become part of the woods, part of the rhythm of their lives, as real and constant as the changing seasons. The world had not forgotten her. After the initial wave of attention, Thomas and Emily had chosen to retreat from the noise. The media had called, cameras had shown up, documentaries had been proposed. Thomas gave one interview, a quiet, thoughtful reflection for a nature journal, and then politely declined all the rest. He wasn't interested in fame. He wasn't interested in spectacle. The story had never belonged to him, not really. It belonged to the forest, to Guardian, to something ancient and nameless that had passed between a dying man and a wild creature in the frozen night. What he carried now was not a tale for headlines but a memory etched into his bones, a truth that didn't need proving. Still, the story had rippled. Scientists debated it. Wildlife organizations studied similar incidents. A new grant was funded for research into animal empathy and cross-species aid. Some tried to explain Guardian's behavior as maternal instinct, misdirected. Others believed it to be a rare but possible form of intuitive response. But Thomas knew better. He had felt it, not logic, not accident, but something deeper, a recognition, a decision, a choice. People came to Pine Lake now, not in droves, but with reverence. Hikers left small offerings by the clearing, artists painted murals, children read picture books inspired by the rescue. The town council eventually placed a modest wooden sign on a nearby trailhead. It read, "Guardian's Path," in honor of the unknown bond between man and wild. Back in the cabin that night, Thomas sat by the fire with a cup of tea, the steam curling into the air like smoke from old dreams. The cabin had changed little. The porch still creaked, the walls still smelled faintly of pine and coffee, but something inside it, inside them, was forever different. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a photograph, Guardian in the snow, her head turned slightly, Thomas slumped across her back. The ranger who had captured the image had never intended to take a photo. He had been following the tracks and raised his camera out of habit, only to catch a single grainy shot before the bear vanished into the trees. The photo was blurry, the focus imperfect, but to Thomas, it was the most powerful image he had ever seen. His hand lingered on the frame. "You know," he said to Emily, who was knitting by the hearth, "I sometimes wonder if she knew what she was doing, if she knew she was saving me, or if she just felt it, like some old wisdom passed down through the fur and bones." Emily looked up, her smile gentle. "I think she knew. Maybe not the way we understand things, but she knew something, enough to act, enough to care." Thomas nodded, his gaze returning to the fire. "It still doesn't feel real. Sometimes I dream about it, and I wake up wondering if it happened. But then I remember how warm I felt, how safe, in the middle of the coldest night of my life." Emily set her knitting down, crossed the room, and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. "It happened, and you're here because of her." The fire crackled quietly. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes brushing the windows like the breath of sleeping giants. Thomas leaned into Emily's embrace, his thoughts drifting, not just to the past but to the future. He had begun volunteering with the local wildlife center, helping educate children about bear safety, forest preservation, and the delicate balance of nature. He had become something of a quiet advocate, not loud, not political, but personal. When he spoke to the children, he didn't tell them the whole story. He told them what they needed to know, that the forest is alive, that it watches us even when we don't see it, and that sometimes, when we're lost, it finds us. A few years later, on the 5th anniversary, something unexpected happened. As Thomas and Emily stood once more in the clearing, setting down their usual offering, a soft sound broke the silence behind them. They turned slowly, hearts quickening. From between the trees stepped a bear, not Guardian, not quite. She was younger, slightly smaller, with a sleek black coat and steady amber eyes. Behind her, 2 cubs padded nervously, hiding beneath her bulk. She watched Thomas and Emily for a long moment, sniffed the air, and stepped closer to the edge of the clearing. Thomas didn't move, didn't breathe. The bear lowered her head slightly, a gesture neither hostile nor submissive, just aware. Then she turned and vanished into the trees, leaving only paw prints behind. Thomas stood frozen, his breath misting before him. "Was that?" he whispered. Emily nodded. "One of hers. Maybe her daughter." They said nothing more. They didn't need to. The forest had spoken again. Years later, still, when Thomas and Emily were older, their story became a quiet legend in the region. People still left offerings, rangers kept the trails clean and safe, and every so often, someone reported a sighting. A large bear at the edge of the forest, watching but never approaching. No one chased her, no one tried to tag her. She belonged to the forest, and the forest had claimed her. In the final pages of his journal, Thomas wrote a single entry, dated exactly 1 year before his passing. She was not a miracle. She was not a myth. She was simply kind, and that was enough to save a life. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth as it moved through the trees, like an old voice whispering through the branches. Spring had returned to Pine Lake. The snow was long gone, replaced by carpets of moss and budding ferns, and the forest was alive with bird song and the soft tapping of woodpeckers on bark. In the clearing, where so many quiet offerings had been laid over the years, where lives had intersected in ways no one could explain, a new stillness settled. It wasn't emptiness, it was reverence. Beneath the oldest pine, its bark rough and furrowed like the face of a weathered elder, a small wooden marker now stood, carved by hand, placed with care. It bore no name, just an image, a bear standing tall with a man draped across its back, both outlined in simple lines. Beneath it, one sentence had been etched into the wood, the forest gave him back. The ceremony had been small, just as he would have wanted, close friends, a few rangers, and Emily. She had stood with her hand resting on top of the marker, her other hand clutching tightly around a small satchel of ashes. She hadn't cried, not then. The tears had come earlier, in private, when she'd walked alone to the spot where Thomas used to pause and listen, where he always left a moment of silence before placing the yearly gift. The silence had not answered her that day, but it had held her, wrapped her in that strange, invisible understanding the forest always seemed to offer. The years had passed with a quiet rhythm. After Thomas's death, he had gone peacefully, sitting in the old porch chair with a mug of tea cooling beside him, his eyes closed and turned toward the trees. Emily had found him in the morning, his expression calm, as if he had simply slipped into the next life, mid-thought, mid-dream. She had sat beside him for a long time before calling anyone, just watching the forest with him one last time. The cabin was quieter now, but it did not feel empty. Emily still made tea every morning and sat on the porch. She still walked the path to the clearing each spring, summer, and winter, always carrying the same basket, fruit, nuts, and honeycomb. And she still spoke aloud when she was there, not expecting an answer, but believing, somewhere deep inside, that she was heard. Sometimes she told Thomas stories about the children in town who now learned about Guardian in school, or about the young couple who had just moved nearby and said they chose this place because they'd heard it was blessed. Sometimes she spoke to Guardian herself.